Hi, how is everybody? Today our lesson is going to be on snow, and I'm going to show you a lot of different techniques. So what I've done is I've made this document that is attached to the Google Classroom, and it's got all the different techniques I'm going to be using for falling snow, for painting the foreground, for doing pine trees with snow hunks on them, and deciduous trees. So look for that and maybe print it out. This is just a painting that I did. I think it was a demo from several years ago. And what we do is we put it away every Christmas. We bring it out. So you might end up with, and this is a quarter sheet, you might end up with a nice little painting that you could use, or maybe use it on a card. And I added a little focal point here of a cardinal later on. So this is all framed. I'll put this aside. So what I'm going to show you here is a couple different things. One of the things, I'm going to show you both pine trees and deciduous trees. And this is a technique where you can use blossoming, where you put a little water in at the magic moment when it's half dry and create a frosty look on the trees. I'm going to show you different techniques for falling snow. One of them would be spattering with masking fluid ahead of time, or spattering with white, opaque white paint, or sprinkling salt. So there's a lot of different techniques. One of the techniques that you could try is, when the sky is still wet, put in some distant pine trees on the horizon, and they'll appear to be very soft and out of focus because you're working on the wet paper. So here's one of the deciduous trees that has the frosty look to it, or the icy look. This would be an example in real life that we would be looking for. And you can create little hunks of snow sitting on the branches of a deciduous tree by putting a little masking fluid in ahead of time. Here you can see where salt appeared to have a falling snow look. And we'll talk about shadows. Notice how fat the tree is and how skinny the shadow is. If you are looking at something flat, it's going to be different than if you're seeing it from the side. So it would be foreshortened. We'll talk about using cool colors to create a texture in the foreground. It depends on the size you want. This is a quarter sheet. This is an 1/8 sheet. And this is a little 1/16 sheet. So you could really work small and get some nice little, maybe even use it as a card. Maybe focus on one thing on a small paper. And I'll talk about how the cast shadows will follow the contours of the terrain. These are nice little foreground weeds, and they each have a cast shadow also. One of the first things you might want to do is establish where your light source is going to be. And I like to make a little line on the tape, once I tape down the paper, to remind me where the light source is. So here's a close-up of some snow that is kind of bumpy and has drifts. And you'll see that the shadows tend to be cool because they would reflect the sky, or maybe even a little more gray. But you unless it's sunset, then you might have some warm shadows reflected. This is using a dry brush, where you're working on dry paper, and you take paint on your brush and just scrape it sideways. So instead of going the direction that the bristles are coming out, you're going against the grain of the bristles. Another nice thing to add is little weeds or bushes in the foreground. And again, you can see those cast shadows become very important. You can add those at the end. Think about details you might want to add, like a fence. Here's a little dry brush technique. Maybe you'll want to show a little stream or a pathway or a roadway. Here's some footsteps, looks like, going off into the distance. And you'll get that perspective where it gets smaller and higher up as it leads us to the horizon. Here's an example of that. So I'm going to show you first, I'm going to demonstrate pine trees that might have hunks of snow that have rested on the actual branches of the pine tree. You could have a more close-up tree where it really shows those hunks of snow, and then off in the distance you might not see it as much. Here's those little weeds added later on with cast shadows. And here's some photos. I would encourage everybody to avoid a tree that looks perfectly symmetrical, like a Christmas tree. Maybe think about making them a little more asymmetrical, where there's spaces between the branches and they aren't all coming out in a perfect triangle. Wonderful, cool colors on the foreground. And you can have a reference of a pine tree that doesn't even have snow globs on it and still create snow globs. This is backlighting. You can see the shadows coming forward, which is kind of a nice effect. So here's a great reference for a pine tree. And you can see that irregularity is kind of nice, where it doesn't look like it's grown on a tree farm. And there's that skinny shadow, depending on how low in the sky the sun is, and often in winter the sun will tend to be a little lower, so you'll get longer shadows. And remember again that they need to be skinnier than the actual tree. And then I'll be showing you some deciduous trees. And here's some little examples of what you might do. Here's that sort of icy look. And again, you can have a reference of a tree that isn't at all in a snowy situation, just so you can learn how tree branches grow. What's the angle that they come off? It depends on the type. If it's an oak tree, it might have some more wiggly branches. If it's a younger sapling, it might have these angles coming up at a pretty distinct angle, and maybe not have every branch coming out in exactly symmetrical spot, you know, have them have one lower and then the one on the other side a little higher. So again, here's just a non-snowy photo, but this would be great to use in your snow painting. Once those leaves drop, you get this starkness to the tree branches. Starting off fat and then getting narrower, and every time they branch off, the twigs or the limbs and the twigs get narrower and narrower. It's kind of fun to have them sort of curvy. And there's an example of where some snow is settled on the branches. Just little bits, and then you get the wonderful giant hunks that are sort of sitting on a pine over Grand Canyon. Here's one that was taken in my son's backyard in Massachusetts, and here you get the nice bits of snow that have settled on the branches, and maybe not only the horizontal branches, but even kind of going up a little bit vertical. If it's fresh snow, it'll sit there for a while if the branch is solid enough and fat enough, and especially in the crooks of the branches. So what I've done here is I've taped off some paper. I've established where my sunlight is going to come from. And I'm going to do a pine tree here. And I'm going to show you some different ways to make those snow globs. One of the ways is to put masking fluid on some areas ahead of time. So what you need to do if you're using a brush for the masking fluid is to get some soap. It could be a bar of soap, or this is brush cleaner soap. So I'm going to suds it up. And you don't want to take your very best, most expensive brush, but I'm getting a round brush and I'm soaping it a little bit. And I'm going to leave the soap in there so that it washes off later. Otherwise, you'll ruin your brush. So this is that Peebo drawing gum masking fluid. And later on, we'll peel it off with one of these rubber cement pickups. So here I've lightly drawn and indicated where my pine tree is going to be. So I'm going to just put in some random globs of snow. And since this is only one way, I'm going to show you how to do the snow globs. I won't fill it all the way up. I'll just put some. And notice I've made it irregular. There's some right in the very front of the tree because these branches are coming out toward us too. And there's some on the side. There's some big ones. There's some little ones. Now this is water that I'm not going to use to paint with, so I'll rinse off my brush right away and kind of put that aside. And that brush should be fine later on. But let me set this aside so I don't use this water. Okay. Now the other thing I might want to do with the masking fluid is if you want to show falling snow. And again, if you use an old toothbrush, it's probably easier to clean it off if you put a little soap on that too. Although it'll be a lot easier to clean off than a soft brush. So I've got a little soap on there, and I'm going to dip this in the masking fluid. And I'm going to randomly spatter, and the spattering might not come out all evenly. So I'll get these big globs probably, and I'll deal with those later. I'm not going to worry about them just yet. And again, I'll put this brush away. And okay, so I could kind of soak up some of this right now, so because I'm going to dry it. And then what I'm going to do is peel these off, these big ones off, before I paint the sky. Okay, now normally I'd want to wait for this to be dry, but since I'm doing a video and I want to speed up the process, I'm going to blow dry it. Now with masking fluid, you don't want to leave it and then come back 2 weeks later while this has been sitting in the sun or something, because it will get so it won't peel off very well. If you have an old jar of Peebo masking fluid, it does have a shelf life. So I would suggest not getting a really big jar, but these little, let's see what size this is. It is, I don't know why I can't see what size it is, but 45 milliliters. So they come in much bigger ones, and I made the mistake once thinking I was saving money, but it went bad. Okay, so I'm hoping that's pretty dry. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to peel off these big ones because I don't want snow globs to be, snowflakes to be that big. Maybe I'll get this one too, because I think that. But these little spatters are going to be kind of nice. So that's one way. Another way will be salt, which I do when it's really wet. And then a third way would be spattering with, actually there's 4 ways. Another way will be spattering with water using a toothbrush at the magic moment, which is the half dry stage. So I'll have my salt ready. Now I'm going to mix up, I figure my horizon is right about here. And I'm going to mix up some blue sky color. I want it to be kind of deep, but not so dark that I don't see my green. You know, I want my tree color to be a rich green, but not, you know, I want it to stand out against the sky. So I don't want my sky to be too dark. I'll use some cobalt blue, maybe some ultramarine. And it's always fun to throw in another color. A warm color, just to give it a little bit of a gray look. So I'll use a little bit of light red up here. I'll have that handy. Now I could wet my paper first, which is probably a good idea, so that you don't end up having it kind of dry on you while you're painting the sky, so it gets splotchy. I want it to be a pretty, I'm not going to have clouds or anything. I'm just going to have a plain blue sky. So I'm going to wet this. And I'm going to wet just down to my horizon line. And then I'll add some distant trees when the sky is still wet. Since it's nice and wet, it's going to give me plenty of time to add the distant trees and the spattering and the salt. So, okay, so here's my blue. I'm going to make it not too watery, because if it's too light, the little snow falling won't show. Dip in a little bit of that brown. Go right off the page. If I wanted, now that you guys know how to do clouds, I could lift out a few little clouds here and there. If I want, or I could take a thirsty brush, and it looks like it wants to be a cirrus cloud right there. I could lift out a few cirrus clouds. Just for interest. You don't want it to be a wet brush, or it'll give you a background. Okay, so while that's really wet, I'm going to sprinkle a little salt on it. I don't want piles of salt, just little bits here and there, and that might add to the effect of falling snow also. Now I'm going to watch for the shine to be gone, that sort of magic moment, and I will spatter some water with the toothbrush. But in the meantime, I'm going to mix a little green. So I'm going to take this, I'm going to take some blue, or maybe some more of a turquoisey blue, like manganese here, and I will add a little yellow. And maybe put in some distant pine trees. We'll get a smaller brush. just to indicate something going on off in the distance there at the horizon. Okay, I think it's time. Look at how that salt is working now. Isn't that great? And just to show you that one more effect, I'm thinking maybe I should do, because this is so strong, maybe I should wait until I do the other dim. Well, let's do a little bit. So I'm just getting some clean water and dipping my toothbrush in there and getting the excess out so I don't have really big drops, and just kind of, and what that will do, and this probably isn't going to show, but this will give little mini blossoms. So that's, I'll do it on the next one also. I'll do it on the deciduous tree one. But boy, that snow is just going crazy there. It's falling all over the place. Okay, so I'm going to dry this now, and I'll do my tree and some foreground things. Okay, so one of the things I can do on the foreground is to have some wet areas, wet into wet. And that just indicates that there's some shadows on the little areas where the snow is piled up. So and be careful, you start to get that you're having so much fun, you fill in all the white. You want to leave some white. Another thing you can do is where it's dry, you can try that dry brush effect. So this is let me clean it off. So this is a brush that's damp, but it's not loaded with water. So I'm going to put a little of this cobalt blue in, and I'm going to show a little rougher texture. Okay, and I can also go in and soften some of that. Now again, the sun is coming this way, so maybe there'll be some mounds. Let's find a small one here. There's a small flat. Maybe there'll be some mounds of snow where just the one side is in shadow. And I'll soften that. Okay, I better stop because I'm starting to fill it all in. Lift some of it out like we did with clouds. Okay, I think I better blow dry this completely. It looks like it's still a little damp. But this is a real snowstorm. Once it's dry, I'm gonna get rid of all the salt. I'm gonna brush it all off. So now I'm gonna think about a pine tree. I will mix up some nice dark green. One of the really good recipes for a dark green is phthalo green, that really bright green with a little burnt sienna and maybe some ultramarine blue. And you get a really rich, dark pine tree green. And I want to have a medium round brush. This is a number 6, should be perfect. There's some sap green, I think. I'm always losing my menu or the different ones. I should actually write my colors on the side of my palette. That would probably be smart. I have so many different palettes and they each have a different arrangement. Okay, so I'm thinking of the main stem or the main, the main trunk of the pine tree being fairly straight. And I'm going to come down and start to, now I got to make sure where I have those little masking fluid globs that I actually make a branch there. And I can go right over it, but I don't want to skip it. Okay, so I'm going to flip my brush over and kind of have, while there's a wet puddle there, kind of get a few little pine needles coming out of it. And I can vary the color, maybe go a little bluer on some areas. Try not to make it be too symmetrical. Sort of quick strokes. If it dries on you and you forgot to do the little pine needle things, you can re-wet it. Now here's another way to do snow globs. So I have the masking fluid ones here. I can also paint around. So create a snow glob there where no snow glob went before. So I'm leaving some of the white of the paper. Then I'll also show you how I'm going to lift some too. Generally, think about the branches getting wider as they get toward the base. Put a little bit more blue in here. And just for fun, I can throw a little yellow in there too, just to get some variety to the greens. So now maybe I'll put a little bit of snow glob here. Or a snow drift. And then I'm going to mix up a little ultramarine and cobalt fairly dark, and I'm going to show a, let's dry this first. And I'm going to show the cast shadow. And the cast shadow will start at the base. And maybe it'll follow the curve of what the snow is doing. So if the snow is kind of going up, it will follow that. If you have the shadows of trees in a road and there's dips in the road, it will follow the dips. Maybe soften the edges a little bit. And it might be getting a little shadow on this side too. So I'm going to kind of darken it a little on the, add a little burnt sienna. Kind of darken it underneath. You want to have at least something dark on the painting to contrast. I'm going to add maybe a little bit more dark in the tree itself. Just to really make your white snow stand out. So here's a branch, and I'm going to make a little snow glob there. See how I painted around that? Here's another one. By painting around it, you can indicate that there's some snow that has landed on it. Okay, and then one more thing I'm going to show on this before I erase the masking fluid. I'm going to use a rigger brush, and this is a brush that's got that's narrow, and it's got a very long hair, so it'll hold lots of paint, and I'll be using it on the tree also. So I'm going to get some brown, gray colors. And I'm going to put some little winter weeds sticking out. Here and there. And you can use really any small brush, but this gives it a nice sort of Japanese brush feel to it. So randomly I'll put some of these poking out of the snow, just so Bambi and his mother have something to eat. Well, the weather outside is frightful. Okay, so gotta get those cast shadows in too. So I'll mix up a little bit of cast shadow, and I'll have from each little twig coming out, I'll have a cast shadow that echoes what the little dry leaves, dry twigs are doing. One more thing I might want to do here is get some more dark green. And these didn't turn out as wonderful as I was hoping, but so these are dry now, and they're sort of fuzzy. Now I can take some darker green, and the lower something is on the picture plane, the closer it is to us. So I'm going to make some little tree areas that are a little darker. It's kind of like we did with mountains, a little lower and a little darker. So that's giving your painting a little depth. So it could be higher in the sky, like a bigger tree, but the base of it is starting a little lower. That means it's closer to us. So we get the very distant, the middle ground here, and then the foreground down here with the tree and the little twigs. And again, I'm making these into little pine trees. Now, why don't these pine trees have snow globs on them, you ask? Well, I don't know, because I didn't plan ahead for that. So they can have some little cast shadows too. Actually, you can make some snow globs on them in just a minute. I'll show you how to do that. Okay, we'll dry this so it's really, really dry. Oh, I meant to show you one other thing. I'm going to take a palette knife. My head might be in the way of the camera here a second. Here it is. Okay. So when it was in the dry or damp stage, I could have scraped out some more texture out of the pine tree. So I'm going to re-wet it and see how I can get a little bit of needle texture from this. I'll hold this up in a sec here. Here, so you can see that little bit of texture from the scraping that indicates the needles of the pine tree. Okay, so I'm gonna dry again, sorry, and I'm gonna use the rubber cement pickup. Looks like this. It's kind of rubbery, and you can use your fingers too, but this kind of saves your fingers. Now all of a sudden we have these stark white globs where I had put the masking fluid before, and we're going to have to tone them down a little bit and indicate where the cast shadows would be, and maybe have some more little bits of snow poking out, or needles poking out of there. So we'll get but more importantly, I want to show just a bit of form shadow on the opposite side of the sun. So it'll be on the right side of the glob since the sun is coming on the left here. So I'm going to make just a little bit of cast shadow on the right side of each of these, including the ones that I painted around, just so you don't leave them real stark. And I will go ahead and take a photo of each of these demos too and put them on the Google Classroom. Now here's another way I can make snow globs. I can actually scrub. So I want to take some fairly clean water here, and this is a bristle brush, and this is one called a Fritsch scrubber. It's kind of worn down, but it's just basically it's like taking an oil paint brush and cutting off the ends of it. So I'm gonna find it now, and I have to keep in mind that green paint tends to stain the paper, so I won't be able to lift it down to the actual white of the paper. But I'm going to take this spot here and I'm going to scrub a little bit, and I'm going to dab it with a tissue. And can you see that I lifted a little bit? So I'll do it again. Take some clean water, scrub it, and I'm damaging the paper. There's no question about it. I'm actually taking a little bit off the paper. But look at, there's a little snow glob where one was not there before. Let's do another one. Should hear a little scrubbing sound. Dab it, and you can see it's still a little green. So I'm going to try it one more time and kind of scrape off. Now, once you do this, you can never really paint back on it. You are damaging the paper. So you can see how I've used masking fluid, I've used painting around, I've used scrubbing. I can also use an X-Acto knife. So here's I'm not cutting it, I'm sort of scraping it on the side. So that's kind of like, and it has to be done dry again. It's kind of like what I just did with the scrubbing. And this is where I could go back in and show just a little bit of snow on these trees that I painted back there. Make sure everything's dry when you do this. And then this actually is another way to show falling snow. You could go in and if you had a perfectly dark blue sky, you could go in and scratch out little areas, and that is falling snow also. Okay. I think that's all I wanted to show in this demo, and then I want to, if you bear with me, I'm going to do a tree one too. I mean a deciduous tree. So, okay, I'm going to put that aside. And here I have already prepared this a little bit and sort of drawn in a tree and put some masking fluid where the trunks would be or the limbs would be. So I'm going to assume that this tree will be fairly dark, so I'm not going to paint around it. I'm going to paint right over it, make the sky, and then make the tree even darker. So let me get this a little cleaner here. Okay, so I'm gonna get some blue for the sky. This time I won't wet it first, I don't think. I'll just go in with some blue. This is cobalt, this is verditer, and they're very similar. Let's just try that. And then I have my brown ready there too if I want to do that. And I'm going to go down to the horizon. Be careful not to go over on this other paper here. Now on this one, I'll do that spattering with water that didn't work very well for the falling snow on the previous one, just because the salt, I won't use any salt. And I'm gonna watch for this to be sort of half dry. And meanwhile, let's do some wet into wet, or let's just do dry brush down here. I could put a little bit of wet into wet here. top and the edge where it was dry. Okay, so now this, oops, and there's where a little water got in there. That's okay. We're gonna actually use that technique later. So now I wanna get as much, just have this toothbrush sort of damp so it doesn't have huge globs. And this is a perfect time to just throw some little bits of water in there, and that's giving it a texture look. So it looks like falling snow. And then later on, I'm going to use some opaque white. And this is a Chinese white watercolor. And I'll just sprinkle that on with the toothbrush also. So that little glob happened. So let's take advantage of that, and that's a background or a blossom, and that's what all these little mini things are. And I'm going to create a little distant tree area back there. On the horizon. Okay, now I've got to dry it completely. We'll see what happens with painting the tree real quickly. If I wanted some of the branches to be a little lighter, at this point, I can take a brush. I'm using a little 1/4 inch flat and getting it thirsty, and I'm gonna actually lift out some branches. So I might have some branches that are, and this guy is pretty dry now, so I'm not introducing water to make it be a background or a blossom. I'm just kind of lifting out paint. Now, if you wanted to do birch trees that were real light, had a real light trunks and limbs, then you might want to use the masking fluid to draw them in first. It's kind of hard to paint around a lot of detail branches. Okay, I'm going to use a small round about this size, and I'm going to mix some dark color, burnt sienna and ultramarine blue, or I could use what's that red? Alizarin crimson, which is a very dark red, and phthalo green, and get some nice rich browns with not a lot of water. So I'm going to hold the brush low like a pencil, and I'm going to start drawing in the leaves, the branches. And I got to make sure where that I include a branch where I've done the masking fluid. Now the tree will get fatter the closer it is to the bottom. And as each section comes off the main trunk, it gets a little narrower. I'm going to use that rigger brush again here in just a moment. If I want to take my palette knife and scrape some texture into the trunk, I can do that. It's a little bit better when it's slightly drier. So here's the rigger brush, and this is a great way to make lots of little twigs and branches. I've filled it with that brown, and it almost just magically creates it as you wiggle it around. So all the leaves have fallen. I can't forget about the places where I've done the snow. I could always add them later if I peel it off and realize that I missed some snow that had settled. And the branch, I'm making sure I'm painting a little branch underneath where the snow was. Then I can use the same techniques that I used on the pine tree to lift off some snow too. Scrape off or scrub off. So all the leaves have fallen. You get these little winter branches here. And while I'm at it, I'll put some twigs in let's make this a little lighter. And then of course I need the cast shadow. And again, the light source is coming from this side, so go a little bit darker. Everything feels kind of cold because I'm using these cool colors. So let's see what happens when we peel off the masking fluid. See what's going to go on. It's got to be really dry. Now, you don't have to use every one of these techniques in your painting, and what you might want to do is make some little ones, several little ones, and just kind of get the hang of it, and then do your masterpiece on that quarter sheet if you want. Okay. There's the snow. And you can see that the spattering just gave it a little bit of texture of falling snow, but I'm going to use some opaque white to get it a little bit more. Now, what if I felt like I really wanted to have a little bit more snow? I could scrape off with the X-Acto knife, maybe in the crook of the branch there. There should have been a little bit more that settled in. Or I could scrub and lift. And that one doesn't make sense, but maybe it does. And if I felt like I needed to go a little darker at this point to emphasize some of these areas, I could do that. Here's the dark side of the tree because of the sunlight. Maybe some of the roots are kind of coming out of the snow there. The other thing is, remember, once we peel off the snow globs from the masking fluid, we need to add a little cast shadow on them. Leaving some of the white, but just giving it a little shadow side. Not cast shadow, excuse me, but form shadow, which is a shadow right on the object itself. Now, one other thing here is we'll take some opaque white, and I'm going to squeeze it onto a part of my palette that I don't use so much. This is the lid, and then I'll mix it up a little bit, get a little liquid in it. Yeah, I've diluted it too much. Let me try that again. So I want to make a pretty rich bit of white here. And then I could do this. I'll try that, where I sprinkle it. Yeah, that works. I won't use the toothbrush this time. Just put it in the brush and then hit it on another brush. Okay? So there's our falling snow. Now, the last one I want to do, and I know this is getting kind of long, but I really do want to show you all three of these things, is this is going to be a tree that has that deciduous look to it. So here's the icy frosty branches. Okay. So we might not see all of the branches. We'll just see a lot of white. Here's a great example right here. And this is a book by Zoltan Szabo. Here's an example that I did. Not wonderful, but where he painted around. He had the wet sky, and then he painted around some big areas of the tree, and then he ran his brush with just a little bit of water at the damp stage when the shine is gone. So he got all of these little icy things, and then went in and added some of the branches lightly here and there, and continued to add some darks. I'm not going to go to that depth, but I'm going to have my little brush ready. Actually, this one would probably be the best, this rigger brush, but any little round would work. Like this little guy here would work, but I don't want to introduce too much water. The nice thing about the rigger is it'll hold water, but it only lets it out a little at a time. So I'm going to get, just to speed things up, I won't wet my paper first. Well, I think I better. Yeah, I take that back. I'm going to wet the paper so I have a soft edge. And I think this water's a little dirty, so you can see where the water's going. And then I will paint kind of around where the tree's going to be. Some blue sky. And I got to have some areas where it's dark, so it shows the branches. So we're getting a fuzzy edge right here. Now I've got to wait for the shine to be gone. And I like to clean off my tape every so often so it doesn't run back in. You know, if this gets partly dry and there's a puddle right here of paint, it might grab and then have these backgrounds right in the on the edge of the paper. This is very small. You might want to work a little bit bigger for this if you want to try this. But, so just to speed things up a little bit, I'm going to blow dry it for just a second to get to that magic moment. Okay, so it looks like it's just damp, and I'm going to take just water on the brush and just kind of run it and introduce a little bit of water. So these are some of the icy branches that are coming out here. And I'll try it with the number 2 brush, just a little tiny brush here. See if I can get the same effect. Oops, got a little bit too much there. That's okay. So you don't want it's just going to sort of give you that sensation of that iciness. Now I can actually pull some of that blue in here for some of the branches. I'm introducing water, but it's also, there we go. Look at how frosty that looks. Now I'm going to make my branches that I see real light. Now let's get the bigger brush. Just start out kind of light. And the paper's still wet, so these branches are kind of fuzzy. Okay, I'm going to dry it now. Now I can mix up a diluted mixtures of branches because I don't want them to be too dark. Let's go. And have them sort of disappear into the frost. Might be a little dark. So you're going to have some lost edges here and there. And you can also lift a little bit, scrub out some if you feel like you filled it in too much, kind of. And Okay, so there's our icy tree. Could have the branches going right off the page here. Okay, I'm going to stop there. All right, have fun experimenting with all these different techniques. And again, I'll have this document attached to the Google Classroom so you can kind of see some of the things that I did. All right, have fun.